Hello and welcome to Security Insights. I'm Gunnar Peterson, CISO at Forder, trust platform for digital commerce. And today we have a very special guest, Andy Ellis, a seasoned technology and business executive with deep experience in cybersecurity, managing risk, and leading an inclusive culture. He's the founder and CEO of Duha, a boutique advisory firm on providing strategic consulting in the areas of leadership, management, cybersecurity, technology, risk, and enterprise risk management. He's the author of 1% Leadership. He's also an operating partner at YL Ventures, advisory CISO at Orca Security, and an advisor to many cybersecurity startups. Andy, great to have you here. Welcome to Security Insights.
Thanks for having me, Gunnar. I appreciate it.
Well, we go back a little ways, and there's a lot of stuff we can talk about here today, but I wanted to start with your book. What prompted you to write the book? Are you just a glutton for punishment? A career in cybersecurity probably does that to certain people, and there wasn't enough pain from working in cybersecurity all these years, and you felt like amplifying it by writing a book, or did you have a message you really wanted to tell?
So I really wrote this almost responsively. So I've had the joy, and I use that word somewhat sarcastically, of going to many, many leadership trainings in my career. I started at Disneyland. I was in the United States Air Force. I was at Akamai, and I've been to more leadership trainings than I would dare shake a stick at. And I've read so many leadership books that people were like, "Oh, you have to read this." And I found that they almost all suffer from a couple of very common failures. One is they could have just been a tweet. Often they have like one message they want to share with you. They very carefully do not articulate the message clearly, because if they did, why would you buy a $30 book or pay for a $50,000 training for your leadership team if all you had
It's
to
a
do
real
is have them
estate
read a
game,
tweet?
and it's a real estate game in the airport bookstore, right? So
Oh, yes, absolutely. And they get in the airport bookstore. I actually found that out in publishing my book. The books in the airport bookstore pay to be in the bookstores.
Mm.
Like, you basically pay by the month for having your book there in hopes that you'll get onto the bestseller lists or sell more books or more speaking gigs. So that's one failure, is they just have this one thing they want to tell you. But the real second failure is they pretend that that one thing is all consuming. They're like cults. They say, if you just do this thing over and over and over again, you'll be amazing. Like,
this one neat trick.
One neat trick. Read Jack Welch's book, and you'll learn that you should stack rank everybody all the time. Which sort of worked for Jack Welch at a specific time with a bloated company that needed to slowly downsize, that had a lot of folks who weren't pulling their weight. Yeah, stack ranking is a way to force your managers to deal with that bloat. But that's not really a great advice for an up-and-coming technology startup. And so I would go to these classes or these leadership development programs, and then they would go out to my whole team, and many folks on my team had this sort of same reaction. They'd be like, "Oh, why am I in this class? What am I supposed to learn?" And so I started to write for them these blog posts, and it said, "Look, here's the summary of the takeaway, and the instructor is going to tell you everything that you should do, and you should just all the time, just do it a little bit." And after a while, I realized that that's basically was my leadership philosophy, was do a lot of things better, not do one thing all the time.
And so it's sort of the opposite of the one neat trick.
Right.
It's having
not one neat trick. It's 54 tricks, except they're not tricks. They're basic fundamental skills. And one of the best compliments that I get on my book when I read reviews online is the person who says, like, there's nothing earth-breaking here. I knew most of this already. And to me, that means I actually did it right, because it's like great engineering. When you come across great engineering in the wild, you're like, that's so obvious, but it's not obvious until the first time somebody shows it to you. And I think great leadership skills is the same way. It's so obvious once somebody explains it, and you're like, oh, of course, I always knew that, except you didn't know how to articulate it until that first time.
I want to come back to a couple of themes there. I think there is a lot in what you say there, and I want to talk about leadership specifically in entrepreneurial tech cultures. The best example today that I'm aware of is occurring in Tel Aviv and in Israel.
Yep.
Israel's been through just an unbelievably difficult time since October 7th. It's been, over 7 months. And, almost immediately after that, horrible day on October 7th, we started to see these signs come out of Israel saying, Israel tech delivers no matter what, and they have,
Yep.
they really have, and it's known as Startup Nation, and I wonder how much of that is due to the ongoing challenges the country faces. Maybe that contributes to how entrepreneurial the country is. I don't know, but what I do know is the country has 9 million people or so, and for if you take any other country or city in the world of 9 million people, you can't find a place where there are companies starting up, getting sold, bringing new products to market. Anywhere else, that level of creativity simply doesn't exist. And as somebody who works with a lot of companies there,
Mm-hmm.
indirectly, in your old roles and directly now, what do you think are some of the factors that drive that innovative culture, that entrepreneurial culture coming out of Israel and Tel Aviv?
So I think there's a lot of reasons that go into this. It's easy to sort of point at one thing. One of my favorite things to think about is Howard Taylor, who's the author of the Schlock Mercenary webcomic, if you recall that. He wrote a blog post about 10 years ago called Meme in a Monoculture. That people asked him, they said, why are so many members of the Church of Latter-day Saints science fiction writers? Because it
Hmm.
turns out they punch above their weight in that whole category, whether it's web comics or novels. There's so many of them. And he said, look, it's not that there's something magical about the church. It's that once a couple of people succeeded doing this, we all talk to one another and we see it's possible and we follow in their footsteps. And you see this in America a lot. You see, the parking garages in Boston are all run by one ethnic community. You have, nail salons tend to be, very specific ethnic communities where it's somebody succeeded doing this and their friends and family and the people they know do it because of that. And you
I've,
end up
I've
with these.
always I've always wanted to own a parking garage. I always thought that what a great investment that would be to own.
Well, especially in Boston, where you're not allowed to build any more parking garages, like limited parking, but more and more people. Great business model. And I think there's a piece of it that is that, which is once you have sufficient density of people who've succeeded as entrepreneurs, more people see that as a path within the community. I think the way in which Israel and Israelis deal with risk, there's nobody else on the planet who has to deal with the level of existential risk that
Mhm.
Israelis deal with. You grow up knowing you are surrounded by a lot of people who would like to kill you and kill all of your neighbors. And what happened on October 7th, was awful and horrible and shocking, but ultimately not actually surprising. Right? This is not like this came completely out of the blue of, oh my God, we had peaceful neighbors who one day did this to us. Hamas has never been peaceful.
Right. So people say September 11th was a failure of imagination by the U.S., but
Yep.
nobody says October 7th was a failure of imagination.
Right. It's a failure of believing the intelligence, and I think a failure of hope and optimism. Right. There's too much belief that there was a path forward that wouldn't hit this. But when you deal with that level of existential risk, you already are a startup. Right? When you think about, you're in a startup, I believe. I work with a lot of startups, and what's the most important metric every startup has? Runway. Right? You literally know the day that you will die if you fail to get enough revenue.
Right.
So it means you take different risks than a public company that is profitable can afford to take. A public company is never going to bet its existence on one product line, but every startup does. And sometimes you say,
By
this product isn't,
definition, right? Yeah.
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 And sometimes you say, this product isn't working. I'm going to completely pivot, throw this out, bring a new product to market because, hey, I've still got 18 months of runway, but this product isn't going to do it for me. Let's completely try again. That's not a pivot that a public company does. When you think about Israelis, right, the idea of taking, oh, we'll take 2 years, we'll go try a startup. And if it fails, we've only lost 2 years. Like, that's totally reasonable. For many Americans, like, that's unthinkable to say, oh, I'm going to like burn 2 to 4 years of my life and maybe get nothing out of it except stress, right? They're like, whoa, why would I do this?
Yeah, and you can almost go back to the times it has happened here. You go back to somebody like Bill Gates dropping out of Harvard
Right.
and going and living in a motel in Albuquerque And his cost was like, okay, I'll do this for a year or two. If it doesn't work, he's still Bill Gates. He can go back to Harvard. He can get another job. Like his
Yep.
risk actually wasn't that high. His uncertainty of outcomes was very broad, but his risk profile was actually pretty low because in the worst case, Bill Gates loses 2 years, goes back to Harvard. Best case, he founds Microsoft, right?
Right.
So was
Yep.
that a best case? I don't know. Was that a
For
net
him,
good?
I think that's a best
It,
case.
it worked out well, yeah.
Yep. And I think another piece of it is when you look at the IDF, the IDF doesn't have make work jobs, unlike almost every other military where you have jobs that are not, that are there. Hopefully your job is mission oriented, but a lot of times you're not actually fighting a war where every single job matters. We're going to put you in a place and we're going to give you the training. So when you think about 8200, and I joke with every founder, we get on ideation calls with people who are just starting to ideate. And I'm like, look, I did this for the US Air Force last millennium. We all get a laugh about it. But so few people go into the military and get deep hands-on technical training and then apply those skills in real world scenarios. That's better than a college degree in many cases. I'd rather hire somebody who, high school 8200 and comes right into the college, into the workforce, than somebody who goes to a college and gets a computer science degree.
Right. They're taking the full life cycle all the way through from the idea. It's
Yep.
not just the theory, it's also the practice. So let's talk about software and cybersecurity, where the most of the time I think you and I have spent most of our time. And there's a lot of technology that comes out of Israel that has nothing to do with cyber or software even,
Right.
right? There's agriculture and all these other
Desalination
things.
technology is my favorite one.
That does seem like a good one. I'm a simple security engineer, so I'm going to stick around the areas that I know a little bit about. And at least in the areas of cybersecurity, it feels like Tel Aviv is so far ahead even of Silicon Valley, where they're inventing not just products but product categories like CSPM, like DSPM, like SOAR, and many others. They're really defining the whole category. Um, I would say embedded in this challenge for a lot of Israeli companies that I see is what I call the Atlantic Ocean problem. And it's like the product ideas exist, the execution exists in one place, the market exists in a different place. And like, how do you see companies, what challenges do you think they have coming across that chasm of understanding the markets, articulating the story? And I think the story is particularly challenging when you're inventing a new category. If somebody already knows what a bread box is supposed to be and you've got a better, faster, cheaper bread box, that's one thing. If you're saying you should really be storing your bread in this bread box, what's a bread box is a totally different challenge. How have you seen that play out specific to Tel Aviv based companies?
Yep. So this is one of the places where at Wild Ventures we really heavily focus on, which is how do we, cross the pond with these companies? Because the reality is the American market is where you're going to make or break as a cybersecurity company. You could focus on Europe, but that's a very fragmented market with very interesting dynamics. So you really do have to come across. And I think we see a lot of failure modes that we try to guide our companies away from. And the single biggest one is trying to do, leadership across the pond. We'll see companies that'll say, well, I'll hire a couple of sales reps in the US, or I'll hire a marketing person in the US.
Right. So I've got a
And
product silo sitting in Tel Aviv or someplace in Israel, and then I've got two salespeople with laptops roaming around
right.
the hallways of a Marriott. And
Yeah.
that does that work?
It's challenging. If you have the right people, it can work, but the odds are really stacked against you. What we try to do is you want to get a leader into the United States really as quickly as possible. The CEO is actually ideal because they're functionally, the way I like to tell CEOs, what your job is you don't have a job except to pick up every job that is currently unfilled. So if you don't have a CRO, you're the CRO. But you almost certainly have a CTO. You don't need to be building product. You have somebody who's managing the product build, but your startup didn't include a CRO, probably didn't include a CMO, so you're going to have to really take on those jobs. And if you're not a great remote manager, why do you think you can manage people across the pond? So try to come across if you can. You really want to early on get somebody affiliated with you, whether it's an operating partner at your seed fund like I am, or just an advisor, some CISO, but somebody who really understands the market and who is really fluent in the English language, right? Somebody who's a strong communicator who can help you with content, with messaging, because all too often you have, somebody who's writing your marketing copy for whom Hebrew is their first language, English is their second language. And while they are fluent, there are nuances of the English language that don't resonate if
So
you
it
don't hit
sounds
them.
like for the people on this side of the pond, those English majors, there's hope for all those English majors out there.
There is, as long as you are also technical enough to understand the concepts.
Okay, so you still need that. Okay.
Yeah, you still need that. So, this is one of the things I do for a lot of our companies is I help them, refine and craft their go-to-market messages. And how do you talk about, like, what does the CISO actually need to hear from you? How do you define a marketplace for them? And too many people think that this is an easy thing, that you just get to show up and say, look, I've got the right sales pitch. I will show it to you and you will buy. And that's, I think, the product of 20 years of bad messaging from sales organizations who've tried to tell us everybody sells. And the reality is nobody sells. Unless you're on a quota, you are not a sales rep, but you are a marketer. And the
Yeah.
difference between the two is that sales is about closing deals. And so you talk to somebody and you have to very quickly determine, are they a yes or are they a no? There are no maybes. If they're a no, stop talking to them. If they're a yes, you want to get the biggest yes possible out of them. If you're a marketer, you deal with the maybes. Your job is to turn maybes into yeses and to turn nos into maybes.
And back into the point I raised at the beginning about the product category, I think marketing plays a particularly important role
Yes.
in when there's a whole new category in play.
Right. So let's take, and sometimes marketing is, my favorite marketing is thought leadership. It's just writing op-eds. I recently wrote an op-ed in CSO Online about the death of the CIO. And now this is it's a completely true op-ed. Like, I really honestly believe everything in here about the fact that the CIO role is going away, especially in new companies. I don't know the answer, so I'm going to ask you, is there a CIO at Forder?
No.
Are you functionally the CIO? Do you own all the software on laptops?
I have some influence on those, yes.
Right. So this is the dynamic I'm seeing in more and more startups, which is, everything is COTS. You're buying SaaS software to operate everything. You have some laptops. The only software on the laptops is either direct from the vendor or security software. And so the CISOs are becoming the CIOs, right? They've got a director of something who works for them that replaced the CIO. And so I write this op-ed of like, hey, CISOs, you'd better figure out how to become a CIO because you're going to get this because we're all SaaS native companies. Now, that's a thought leadership piece about getting the phrase SaaS native into the conversation for SaaS security companies. Because if you're selling SaaS security, like two of our companies, Grip and Valence, like if there's a CISO who doesn't believe they run in SaaS, you can't sell them SaaS security. So the first piece of marketing isn't even talking about the problems that these two very different companies solve. It's just talking about the fact that SaaS is a CISO problem.
Interesting. So specialization is an area, I think, for US folks working with Israel companies, there's different ways that those cultures approach specialization. And it I think maybe ties into something you raised earlier about the sort of the holistic learning that you get from being in the Israeli military. And Tal Keenan from Sky Harbor, who flew in the IDF, he compared and contrasted how your alma mater, the USAF, flies missions in a series of specialized functions, sort of like a Formula One car, which everything is highly specialized and precise. At least that was his conception of it. Maybe it was different when you're actually on the ground, but that specialization wouldn't work nearly as well in Israel, where he compared how the IDF flies missions to a pickup truck with a lot of tools ready to go off road and do anything on day one. And I think there's something to that distinction that he raised in the holistic approach that you see out of Tel Aviv companies solving age-old problems like data security from multiple angles and unexpected angles. Can you think of any examples where you've seen that happen in companies that you've worked with?
So it's a fascinating analogy. I don't know that I completely agree with Tal, but it's onto something. If you think about the way the Air Force flies missions, it's from platforms. right? The F-16 is a platform. It's not a fighter jet, right? There's F-16s that are, you add on the right modules and now it's, low altitude night flyer designed for, reconnaissance missions, flying under the radar. Put in a different one and they're just a different package and they're designed to take out anti-aircraft sites, right? Same airplane, very different loadout, right? So instead of like being it's like the Swiss Army knife airplane, except instead of being the Swiss Army knife, it's like that adaptable socket wrench that you put different sockets on, but it can only do one thing at a time. Whereas I think the IDF tends to just fly the Swiss Army knife. It's like, okay, we have to do every mission off of the same plane because we can't have like a whole fleet of specialized aircraft. And I do recall we used to sell F-16s to certain nations in the Middle East, and they were very insistent that they got all of the package put onto the F-16 because it was a status symbol that they had everything on the same F-16. And we were like, you recognize it is now bad at every job instead of being like good at just one of them.
It's like the that time when Homer Simpson designs the car, right?
Yes,
So, yeah.
it sort of had that effect. But I think there's something to it, which is you have a set of tools in front of you and you have a mission. How do I apply them? And that's absolutely a thing you see in militaries all over the world. I wouldn't even say it's just an IDF thing. I think you just get a more rapid pace of stressed evaluation. We saw it in the US military. We would go build things. I worked in acquisitions for a while, and we would build things that would take, 10 years to get to market. And by the time it got in the warfighters' hands, they had gone and solved it by going to Best Buy and buying and strapping together some random things. And we're like, oh, I guess that solved the problem. And so I think that's the approach you see in the Israeli mindset, which is how do I take the technologies I have, the problems I see, and throw them together? Now,
and so go ahead.
I talk to a lot of ideators, and sometimes they're just so woefully wrong. Like they see a problem, they see a technology, and like, I could just solve this problem in 30 seconds, give me $10 million to go build the startup. And I have to come in and say, well, look, as a longtime CISO, I will tell you, I tried to solve that problem that way. Here's why you're wrong. It won't work. And so you have to be blunt and share that. And then they come back and they'll try again. And sometimes they're right. But most of the times, but it's that willingness to try, to say, I think I can solve this problem, and then hear the feedback, whether they're right or wrong.
Yeah, and unafraid to maybe confront the real world as it exists, as opposed to how maybe a specialist would approach something where I think a specialist is more used to seeing a just so problem, because the things, you're the dessert chef, you only see desserts. If you're making the whole meal, you're running the whole kitchen and using all the tools.
Yeah. And call
way.
back to your Microsoft comment earlier. I remember reading an essay back in the 90s, and it was I think it was the Redmond approach versus either the Berkeley or Cambridge approach. They're talking about the difference between the way Microsoft built technologies and the way academics built technologies, sort of a Microsoft versus Linux thing.
It always comes back to that. It always comes back.
But it basically said, there's two different ways you solve problems, bring them to market. One is you see a problem, you half-ass a solution and you get it to market fast, and then you iterate on it to make it work. But you capture market because there's a real problem, and even if you only solve it 10%, that is 10% more than anybody else. Or you could try to solve the whole problem fully and specialize and have the perfect solution, and 10 years after the other guy has captured the market, you show up with a product that doesn't quite work, but would solve 90% of the problem. And the other guy's only solving 70% of it, but they're solving it well, having iterated with real customer feedback in real time.
I think you just described an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. And I'm not going to insert names of companies that fit the latter profile, but we can that'll be
There's a lot of them. I think the bigger
exercise
you are
left
as a
to the
company,
listener,
the more likely that's how you approach products.
So bringing it back to teams for a second, when it comes to building a global team, maybe after the CEO founder has come from Tel Aviv to live in the US and fill all of the different roles one at a time, like when you scale out beyond that, step 2, step 3, beyond that, what are some of the things that you've seen that don't work in taking that second and third step, and some maybe that are useful there?
Yep. So I think it's really important to have a lot of communication, but to try to reduce the noise of communication. I think a lot of people say, oh, well, I'll have Slack with 1 million channels in it so we can talk about everything. And then you overwhelm people with noise and they don't know what to read. And so they sort of stop paying attention other than the 5 channels that matter to them. But you need to have regular touch-ins. You know, if you're a company of less than 100 people or even up to 1,000 people, everybody should see the CEO on a regular basis. You know, maybe that's a monthly all hands, maybe it's even a recorded message, but they need to hear what you're doing, what you're saying, what your vision is for the company. Because if they don't know what the company's doing, they're going to do what they think is right. And the less that they're aligned with you, the more likely they're not helping you. You need to like rigorously look and say, you know, how is everybody advancing the mission? How do I keep everybody, you know, driving to the same thing? And listen to the people, and have that channel go the other way. Who's the most junior person in your company? Do you know what they do? Do they get to tell you what they're doing? And why do you think that's valuable? Because it should be, because, you know, dollar for dollar, the most valuable employees you have are usually your lowest paid employees.
Right, and you get the dinosaur brain problem very quickly, where the tail of the dinosaur and the tiny brain of the dinosaur relative to the size is significant. Well, let's. I wanted to talk. If you have a specific company that fits this profile, I'm interested to hear. But you know, when it comes to maybe the second and third level of maturity and putting, you know, process governance around a company that is growing, or even, you know, one that's just a big established company that's growing, changing its technical footprint, you know, process governance is something that is a problem at all levels of scale. Do you have specific you know, thoughts or new technologies or entrepreneurs in that space that you've found interesting?
Yeah, I've got one, and let's describe the problem first, because we said process governance, and I suspect a lot of listeners are like, oh, I both of those words.
But when they put them together, we put them together.
No, it's not like peanut butter and chocolate. It doesn't actually make it better for most people, but it should. You know, is the art of risk reduction and really hazard reduction. We want to make things less risky. And almost every security solution is a process solution. Even if you put in place a technology, that's implicitly a process that the technology is running, is applying, people are using it. But nobody likes to really write down their processes. We just sort of have them implied. Oh, when, you know, somebody gets let go from the company, there's a bunch of stuff that's going to happen. And most people don't write down all the things, but like 17 different organizations think they know what they're supposed to do. So let's take that as a process. You as the CISO, governance means, do you know that that process works? That's it. That's when you hear the word governance in GRC, that's all that governance is. Do you know if the controls that you implemented actually are happening? And when phrased that way, everybody should be like, oh my God, process governance is the only thing I should care about as a CISO, because it doesn't matter if I fix risk if I only believe I fixed it, but I actually haven't done it. So one of the companies in our portfolio, very young company, fantastic. It's they're repeat entrepreneurs. So it's the former Twistlock team, which was also
I remember them very well.
So they looked at this problem and they looked at a solution in a completely different space, which is process mining. And so process mining comes out of the operations research space, where you say, look, if you've got a company and you're trying to figure out how to make it more efficient, why don't you just, you know, look at every artifact of the process? You don't care what the process is. Just look at the artifact. So if you have an accounts receivable function, you can track, like, when does somebody get notified because there's an email record, and when does money come in, and you can look at all of these different pieces and how long it takes to bill, and you can mine that and build an actual view, a forensic view of what your process really looks like. And you can notice things about it, like say, oh, look, it turns out you actually run this report on Thursday afternoon in the US, and you send it to your billing team, your accounts receivable team in Israel. Well, Friday's a holiday in Israel.
Right.
So boom, like you ran it on Thursday, they're not going to see it until Sunday. So they get it on Sunday. They send something out their Sunday morning, but now it's going to sit until Monday morning in the US and then get lost in the weekend email. So you would notice something like this and say, how do I fix my process to account for, you know, things that I hadn't really considered? and I can detect variance. And so Gutsy took this and said, let's do this to security processes. So you never have to write down your process, because that's always what kills any process-related improvement work, is making people document their own process. Instead, they just connect to all of your IT and security systems and infer what your process must look like.
And
then
so again,
detect
taking the world as it exists, not
as it
as it
exists.
exists. Yeah.
Yep. And so you say, this is what a termination looks like. And 80% of the time you get it right, and 20% you don't. And here's what that 20% looks like. Right? So it gives you an opportunity to fix process failures without having to do sort of that really heavy lifting to figure out what the process is, just by instrumenting the systems that are already writing down logs for you.
And did they focus on any particular area today of the tech stacks? You know, are they focused? It sounds like identity provisioning and deprovisioning would
Yep.
be a natural. Are
That's
there
a
others
natural one, but it's really almost any process that you could imagine. But provisioning and deprovisioning is sort of the easiest thing to sort of explain
Sure.
to people. But you can look at, remediation processes and
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, look, like maybe it's the same thing. You're sending email, from one process to another, because this is a big failure I see in a lot of companies, which is you have different ticketing systems for different organizations. And so when
Yes.
one team assigns a ticket to another team that doesn't use that ticketing system, the other team has to open a new ticket in their system. If that ball drops right there, you're basically stuck, because one team thinks it's been handed over, the other team never received it. And so now you could look at both systems and say, hey, like, here's the problem. You got a status update that's not matched by the ingest somewhere else. Here's where your ball got dropped.
It does seem like a perfect example of a lot of themes that we've talked about, not skipping steps, digging into places that people hadn't thought of, and bringing something new to market. So that Gutsy will be an interesting company to
Yeah.
follow. I love the repeat entrepreneur idea too. I do have one last question for you. I want to switch to a local discussion,
Yep.
which is what is your take on Drake May? I know you've probably spent more time than me thinking about Drake May. It's a couple months away before we really have to answer these questions. But
Yeah.
what are your early impressions?
I always love getting Patriots questions and not having to throw it in against like a Jets fan who's the podcast host. So, first of all, very early, and I am not a quarterback expert. But
Okay.
I go to a lot of
There,
games and I
there's
listen to
21
them.
other players on the field, it turns out, not just
There
quarterback.
are, in fact, a lot of other players. So here's my first take. Drafting him was the right thing to do.
Okay.
I know a lot of people like, oh, they should have drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. And to which my
He did
answer
look
is,
pretty good, in fairness.
oh, no, Marvin Harrison looks fantastic. But you can go through a list of all of the teams that have drafted a superstar wide receiver instead of a quarterback. The Detroit Lions with Calvin Johnson, the Arizona Cardinals with Larry Fitzgerald, the Atlanta Falcons with Julio Jones. Like, you can go through this list, and you do not win championships that way. And in fact, arguably, you make it harder to get a great quarterback, because that player will win games for you, but not enough to make you a champion.
Okay.
So you have to have the quarterback. And so it's always a gamble. Will this guy work out? From the conversations I've seen, he needs to improve his footwork. He does not have NFL quality footwork, but I'd rather him not have it at all, which is sort of where he is, so he can learn the skill, than be like, oh, he's got 80% of it, but he's screwed. He'll never get to 100%.
So the Crafts can sign him up for a ballet class or something like that, and he can get
Basically,
his
and that's
footwork
basically
where it needs
apparently
to be.
what he's been doing, is like a
Okay.
lot of footwork drills, but he can throw the ball. He's got a great arm. He's got, he can put the ball on target as well. I also like they drafted Joe Milton in the 6th quarter as a developmental prospect quarterback. This kid's also got an amazing arm.
Okay.
So, like, they've got 2 quarterbacks. Both of them have potential. Like, obviously, I want to see Drake May as the starter. Do not want to see him as starter week 1. I want to see Jacoby Brissett as the week 1 starter.
Yeah,
Like, Drake
give him
May
some time.
will be, I think, ruined, because this is a brand new offensive line. They need some time to gel and develop and protect the quarterback before you put a rookie back there.
Yeah. Well, speaking as security people, with the quarterback can't throw if he's on his back, right? So that's
Exactly, right. That's the biggest thing. And he's got to learn to stand in a pocket. That means he needs a pocket to learn to stand in it.
Well, Andy Ellis, I can't thank you enough for joining today. I think your book, 1% Leadership, is definitely one that folks should turn on. You also have a bite-sized chunks
Yep. Yeah, I send
version
out
of it, if I'm not
a
mistaken.
newsletter about every other week. It's at Duha1, DUHAONE.substack.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that and your insights on, applying leadership in some of the most interesting companies out there in the whole world. And can't thank you enough for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Gunnar.